Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Happy New Year. This is the first Atlas lecture, actually, for 2024. And I'm going to give a very brief introduction to our speaker today, Dr. Nuttall. Acquired his PhD from the University of Uppsala in Sweden and his MA from the University of Liverpool in the UK. His research interests include Aegean Prehistory, landscape archaeology, material culture, ceramics, GIS, cycladic archaeology, survey archaeology, excavation, and seascapes. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher in the field of humanities and social sciences, hosted both by the Swedish Institute at Athens and the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. Today, he will talk about coastal landscapes and the application of GIS-based in Aegean Prehistory. And thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you. And before I begin in earnest, I would just like to express my thanks to the organizers of the Atlas Lecture Series for their very kind invitation. In my talk today, I will introduce and discuss some methodological approaches to space in coastal landscapes, otherwise known as coastscapes, focusing particularly on Aegean prehistory. This work is part of a Swedish Research Council international postdoctoral project, hosted by the Swedish Institute at Athens and the National Kapodistrian University of Athens. And I would just also like to take this moment to express my thanks for their support during this research. As with any concept, the best place to begin is often at the beginning. My 2021 doctoral thesis, Seascape Dialogues, presented an analysis of over 500 archaeological sites, looking into human-sea interaction from the late Neolithic to the end of Late Bronze Age 1. This seascape perspective advocated that the sea could be more than just a vacant space between lands and could rather be imbued with a meaning and even act as a social agent within some socio-cultural constructions. While there has been some very important and notable work on several elements of human-sea interaction within Aegean prehistory, or as I call it, the seascape perspective, my thesis identified a lack of attention towards embodiment and how communities situated themselves over time in place in relation to the sea. My theoretical perspective was influenced by material engagement theory, which I will not go into in too much detail here this evening, but only to highlight the issue with space. While material engagement theory correctly identified the crucial role of material and embodied practice in understanding past human cognition, the role of the world as part of this discourse was more fuzzily defined. The model proposed that agent and culture were embedded within this world, though it is often unclear if this was a social or a physical world. This fuzziness was resolved in my doctoral thesis by incorporating spatial theory, particularly the distinction between space and place. In the context of human-sea interaction, therefore, I argued that the creation of a seascape was the very act of giving meaning to the sea, converting it from a space into a place. My analysis followed a multi-scalar approach, beginning with a macro-scale analysis of being in place in relation to the coast, a mesoscale analysis of embodied practice, and a microscale analysis of iconography and ritual expression relating to the sea. And it is in the first element, being in place, in relation to the coast, or otherwise a coastal proximity, that today's talk is situated. The first issue that immediately arose was how to measure coastal proximity. My first thought was to measure in Euclidean distance terms, but this approach entirely disregards the important role taken by the Greek landscape and also the embodied action of those people moving through this landscape. Eventually, after much trial and error, I utilized the least cost path function of ArcGIS, or ArcMap as it was known then, in order to measure coastal proximity of a site towards its coastline. In my doctoral thesis, I termed this quality coastality, though now I've preferred the term coastal proximity, which I think more accurately reflects the function of this analysis. The least cost path algorithms generated an abstracted value, which was relative to the cost of movement between site and coast. These were presented in my doctoral thesis, though with time pressures it was not possible to rectify these values into time costs or energy costs. In my current postdoctoral project, Populating the Coastal Landscapes of Greece, I have been given the opportunity to expand some of the work I presented in my doctoral thesis. The purpose of my presentation here this evening is to present a series of spatial markers which gauge the extent of coastscape engagement in the Aegean from the start of the Neolithic until the terminal phase of the Bronze Age, incorporating a wealth of fieldwalking data from across the Aegean region. The markers presented today attempt to quantify and classify the integration of the maritime to prehistoric settlement patterns. The aim of this presentation and my postdoctoral work more generally is to trigger a more comprehensive spatial analytical approach to coastal areas in prehistory. Coastal landscapes, or coastscapes, have been defined by Thomas Tartaron as the territorial coastal zone passes to the interior, inshore waters, and the visual seascape. However, to focus solely on coastscapes as a spatial unit can only confirm or deny the existence of coastal activity and does not consider the wider context of settlement patterns. For example, a cessation of coastal activity could indicate a general avoidance of the coast, though this would need to be qualified by looking further inland to determine whether a lack of activity is a landscape-wide pattern or just an issue towards the coast. The solution, therefore, is to study all available spaces, including coastal, inland, and insular areas, to generate a more holistic understanding of a societal investment in coastal living. However, first I need to address why I focus on Greece itself. While the Mediterranean Sea has the highest coastline to extent ratio for similar-sized and even larger seas, the Aegean Sea has by far the longest coastline length of the various seas of the Mediterranean, mediated by thousands of islands and littoral zones. As a result, coastal landscapes form a fundamental component of Greek continental and insular landscapes, making an understanding and appreciation of coastal living an indispensable part of Aegean prehistory, and indeed I would also argue for later periods too. Greece has some of the most extensively researched landscapes through fieldwalking survey in the Mediterranean, providing a huge data source for investigations of coastal proximity in settlement patterns. A fundamental issue, however, has been how we perceive space, which has permeated into research design and archaeological interpretation. First, it is necessary to define space, but I do here so briefly. Such an enterprise has confounded the most prominent philosophers of the past 400 years, and a singular definition is not possible, and I'm not going to believe that I can be the one to give you that singular definition. However, it is possible to provide two fundamental philosophical perspectives towards space. In the first, the earlier definition, space was a container within which things, events, and matter could be found. This perspective has a long history, though is generally associated with the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. In this perspective, space exists independently of things and events, a perspective that can also be termed an absolute concept of space. The alternative perspective is that of a relational space, in which space is located in the relations between material objects and things. In this perspective, space is relative, being measured in terms of cost or time rather than Euclidean or cartographic distances. Within the field of Aegean prehistory, space has been a fundamental undercurrent, but not explicitly theorized until relatively recently. My discussion here, therefore, is necessarily selective and serves not to critically analyze, but rather to highlight key trends within Greek archaeology more generally. Spatial or topographical approaches to the Greek landscape generally predate archaeology as a discipline and have their nexus within the Grand Tour tradition of Western European travellers to Greece. The Grand Tour led to an interest in ancient Hellenic culture, particularly its epigraphy and architecture, though their position within space and within a landscape was little regarded. The French-led Moria expedition was notable, however, for the introduction of a somewhat more spatial approach to ancient remains. The expedition was organised into various categories such as natural history, architecture, and archaeology. The archaeological survey encompassed a more systematic exploration of traveller accounts, both ancient and modern, married with the cartographic mapping that was being undertaken during this time. A different approach was here being taken, with the systematic recording of topographical features, flora, fauna, and the names associated with these landscape features. The key was the placement of these ancient remains within a topographical understanding of the landscape, underpinned by a cartographic tradition that had otherwise been omitted previously. This approach was not applied everywhere, however, and focus more generally remained on artifacts and the wider discussion of typologies and chronologies. The period from the 1870s to around 1920 saw an opening up of the Greek landscape, with a variety of smaller archaeological sites explored and excavated. This period saw an increasing appreciation of the topographical significance of the Greek landscape in understanding the historical context of various archaeological sites, even if this concept was not theorized. And here I list the fairly prescient words of Swedish archaeologist Samuel Vida. In several instances of early fieldwalking tradition in the Aegean, distance between archaeological sites was denoted in time spent walking, rather than purely by distance alone. While this may have been a necessity before the widespread adoption and availability of the car, it betrays a certain appreciation of being in place, considering archaeological sites not simply as dots on a map, but as relative to space and the landscape context they were contained within. This space, however, as I repeat, was also fairly rarely defined or critiqued. The shift towards a culture historical perspective beginning in the 1920s saw a different perspective towards space. Popularized particularly by the work of Gordon Childe and Corsina, the approach emerged from a need to prove links between ancient societies and modern nation states. Culture groups are one of the enduring paradigms of this scholarly approach, and Aegean prehistory still today uses concepts derived from this time, where terms such as Cycladic, Minoan, Helladic, and Mycenaean are still used today to denote both time and space. Culture groups were defined and delimited according to material culture and space, overlying a landscape, typically represented by a line drawing map, to which it had no link. The development of the culture historical approach may have been, as Bruce Trigger has suggested, a response to a growing awareness of geographical variability in the archaeological record, though space was considered little in determining the development of ancient societies, and work typically consisted of synthetic narratives of what happened where. Being an early adopter of the new theoretical approaches, Aegean prehistory was the domain for the first publication, or the first explicitly processual piece of work within Greek archaeology. Colin Renfrew's The Emergence of Civilization introduced a systems-based approach, dividing prehistoric Aegean society into a variety of interlocking subsystems. The positivistic approach of processualism introduced and developed revolutionary new methodological approaches towards fieldwork, analysis, and interpretation, though archaeology in Greece was slow to adopt these new approaches, though one in particular was readily adopted, that of systematic archaeological survey. Such projects typically divided space into predetermined units known as transects, before a systematic sampling of the landscape surface through field walking. This approach differed from previous field walking exploits in that they had an explicit methodology and typically collated evidence from all chronological periods encountered. In contrast to culture history, processual archaeology did critique the theme of space, and in some ways attempted to deconstruct the concept. Ian Hodder and Clive Orton's spatial analysis in archaeology attempted to go beyond the basic distribution map and perform a more detailed and systematic study of spatial patterning in archaeological data. The approaches offered include settlement patterns, statistical approaches, and regression analyses, and took a predominantly statistical and mathematical approach. The work, however, took a very positivistic slant, emphasizing spatial quantitative approaches, which viewed space as having a neutral quality, containing dots divorced from action. A new development in this period, and relevant to the second half of this talk, was the increasing use of computational methods, such as geographic information systems, or GIS, to process and model large quantities of data. Processual works generally considered the big picture of society and can be credited with the first introducing an awareness of the relationship between human groups and their environment. A so-called ecological approach even if this perspective saw environment as a resource to be mastered by human societies in the never-ending quest for surplus. A key criticism of this perspective is the wider lens view on human society, considering developments as part of a wider narrative, incorporating a so-called God trick in making everything visible all at once, an aerial view or helicopter view of past society. The focus on various subsystems of society, spatially demarcated concepts that may have overlapped and intertwined, for example, mortuary, religion, and politics within the burial arena, projecting a view that would not be recognizable to people of the past. The approach rendered space as an inert quality, and this was evident from the very earliest work on the issue, with the processual approach intending to discover, and I quote, regularities that are in a sense spaceless and timeless. If human behavior was cross-cultural across time and space, then neither time nor space in themselves was considered to be particularly important. Space was the container for the countless civilizations, subsystems, and events that it contained, and landscape was a resource to be exploited. These processual concepts, however, were not without critique. Building on the critique of positivist social science in other disciplines, the late 1980s and early 1990s saw the emergence of a loosely unified critique of processual archaeology, typically termed post-processual archaeology. With regard to space, perhaps the most influential work was Christopher Tilley's A Phenomenology of Landscape, Paths, Places and Monuments, which argued, and I quote, space cannot exist apart from the events and activities within which it is implicated. This so-called phenomenological approach advocated for the investigation of how people related to architecture and landscapes, with everyday experience the locale of individual agency. And these perspectives were soon adopted in Aegean Prehistory. Since the 2000s, there has been a proliferation of work on so-called scapes in Aegean Prehistory, which at its core focuses on embodied experiences of action. Deathscapes, for example, center on embodied action within the context of funerary spheres. Islandscapes focus on the dynamic quality of being part of an island society, and taskscapes focus on tasks as constitutive acts of dwelling. A multitude of other scapes have been identified in academic discourse, most relevant here today, this evening, being seascapes and coastscapes. The key element here is the consideration of these differing concepts through the lens of human agency and experience, with the concept that there is no singular objective perspective to the past or space. So, with the theoretical baggage outlined, how has this played out in Aegean prehistory with regard to coastal landscapes? Despite a wealth of landscape archaeological work, analytical methods concerning the spatial relationship between sites and paleo coastlines are generally descriptive without critique, indicating chronological periods of greater coastal proximity based on cartographic visualizations, and occasionally an indication of a relationship between site and coastline in terms of Euclidean distance. And as you may be able to see on this slide, a range of coastally focused settlement patterns have been identified in Aegean prehistory through field walking survey, and these have been interpreted in a variety of different ways. Conversely, some periods of coastal avoidance have also been identified, and these shifts away from the coast have also been variously interpreted. Generally, however, a feature of discussion is the self-evidential nature of the coastal zone and the lack of a rigorous methodology for interpreting coastal proximity. There are, however, two notable exceptions to this trend in the Aegean. The first is the Antikythera survey, where one of the covariates used in their multivariate regression model was distance from coast. This Euclidean distance was then taken and square root transformed and used to inform interpretations of coastal proximity. The second is the Vrocastro survey of Crete, where the coastal zone, zone number 1, is clearly defined. Euclidean distance from coast to site was also considered as a variable. With these two examples, it is much more clear how interpretations of coastal engagement were generated, even if there was a lack of incorporation of the topographical features of the landscape itself. In much of the research, the coast is rarely defined itself as an analytical unit, leading to uncertainty over exactly where its boundaries end. Missing is an anthropocentric appreciation of space and landscape, which allows access to a more phenomenological understanding to travel, coastlines, and prehistoric sites. and it is within the context of these criticisms that the following spatial markers will be introduced. So, the first analytical marker I present today goes in some way to resolving this issue of Euclidean perspectives to space. Coastal proximity analysis focuses on the effort or cost of movement between site and coast, operationalized using QGIS and the least cost path function. The purpose is not to reconstruct the main route from a site towards the coast, rather to determine the fastest possible route between site and coast as an index of its position in relation to the coastline. The first step in this process is to represent the landscape through an elevation raster, and then to estimate the paleo sea level for different periods of prehistory. This in itself is a fairly complex issue, and the estimations are here derived from the use of digital bathymetric models and the work of Kurt Lambeck, who made a series of shoreline estimates for the Holocene period in Greece. It is acknowledged that localized episodes of alluvial, colluvial, or otherwise alternative forms of landscape change could have affected the geomorphology of different regions in different ways, though I would argue that these estimates are likely to be closer to the ancient reality than the present sea levels that we have today. The next step involves depicting the paleo shoreline as a series of points. This is done by extracting the contours from the project raster, selecting only the sea level. In QGIS, this generates a polyline which represents the ancient shoreline. To make this workable for the least cost path, the polyline is converted into a dense series of points, with a shapefile populated with these points which delineate the paleo shoreline for the period under study. In GIS-based modeling of least cost paths, the cost surface, a representation of the effort required to traverse through this reconstructed landscape, is crucial for evaluating different routes. This can be readily calculated using a standard slope analysis, which calculates a slope in degrees of inclination. A particular challenge, however, arises when encountering cells of zero slope, which misleadingly registers having no cost in least cost path analyses, even though distance is still being covered. A practical workaround is Tobler's hiking function, which allocates a time-based cost for each degree of slope, with a maximum speed of 6 kilometers per hour. Incorporation of this function allows for a better estimation of the time spent on each path, anthropomorphizing the analysis, which otherwise would have resulted in an arbitrary cost value, which, as it did in my doctoral thesis. The outcome of this is a time surface raster, which informs the time-based output of the generated least cost path. And the final step is the execution of the least cost path analysis itself, which computes the most efficient route between two specified points, using the cost raster to inform the total expenditure on a particular route. The least cost path analysis, as it is formulated in this study, calculates effectively the cost of travel between coast and site, with the end result being a value which is derived from time. So, the utility of any analytical approach, however, is best measured by its application. And to highlight the capabilities of this analytical tool, I use prehistoric data from the Southern Argolid Survey as an example. The Southern Argolid Survey, published in 1994, investigated the southeastern peninsula of the Argolid. The coastal proximity values for 83 prehistoric sites within the study area were taken and assigned to chronological periods based on the dating of the sherds reported from each site. A median value was then generated to establish trends between different periods. The assignment of the site types was made following the author's own published guidelines, though I should add that only one site size was given for each site to cover all periods, so sometimes it's difficult to figure out if a site that's 2 hectares in the classical period is necessarily the same size in prehistory. Unfortunately, this is the limitations of the data that we have. So, here are the results. The first thing that is immediately obvious is that the Middle Helladic to Late Helladic II period within the study area, highlighted in red, has a much higher coastal proximity than the Early Helladic or the Late Helladic III phases. And for the sake of clarity, this median time is calculated from the coastal proximity values generated earlier for the various sites that have evidence from each specific period. And the count here refers also to how many sites were relating to that specific period. A lower value indicates a shorter travel time towards the coast, while a higher median value indicates a higher and longer travel time towards the coast. However, if we look at the data more closely, and this time by site type, a slightly different pattern emerges. The major sites of Middle Helladic to Late Helladic II, which were on the coast, continued in use during Late Helladic III. This means that the new settlements that raised the median value in Late Helladic III are new foundations placed further inland. This means that most of the population of Late Helladic III was still located in coastal areas, while now, in addition, the inland was also exploited. This contrasts with Early Helladic I and Early Helladic II, where the major habitation centres were positioned slightly further inland. These data suggest that while the configuration of the paleotopography of the southern Argolid was broadly the same throughout the Bronze Age, the way that this same space was used changed slightly over time. In some phases, the interior of the region was more utilised, while in others, this space was abandoned in preference for areas closer to the coast. Now, while it would be tempting to make the observation that those phases with a greater evidence of network integration, for example, the International Spirit System of Early Bronze Age II, or the Mycenaean Kini of Late Helladic III, conversely experienced a lower general coastal proximity, it is actually more accurate to suggest that these phases witnessed a greater general utilisation of more of the landscape, which is likely to have been stimulated by external contact and the stability of Early Bronze Age II and Mycenaean systems, with this stability providing an opportunity to focus more on agricultural activity further inland. It is, however, also important to stress that phases of disruption, for example, Early Helladic III and Late Helladic IIIc, do not see the same settlement pattern responses with respect to coastal proximity. While these collapse events certainly had a climatic element, Early Helladic III saw the beginning of a coastward shift, while Late Helladic III saw the opposite, an inland shift, perhaps reflecting the social nature of the Bronze Age collapse and the need to avoid the coast for safety that does not appear to have been so present in the early Helladic III southern Argolid, though I would add that further evidence might change this picture if there is more work in this area, though given that this area has already been quite extensively surveyed, it seems like a fairly safe conclusion at this stage, though you never know what's lurking beneath, I guess. While coastal proximity determines the value representative of the spatial relationship between survey sites and the coastline, the second marker I present today, the Coastscape Engagement Index, addresses the extent of coastal land use within a landscape. Its primary purpose is to express how much of a surface area of the coastal zone was being used in any given period. For such an analysis to be effective, however, it requires high-resolution land use data from fully published and transparent fieldwalking surveys. This data should also include coastal and inland zones to gauge the relation between spaces of human activity and the coastline. This unfortunately discounts several fieldwalking surveys which do not border the coastline. The contribution each site makes towards the index is based on its size or extent. A weighted regression model is enacted, prioritizing coastal activity by assigning a higher coefficient score to sites closer to the coast and a lower coefficient score to those further away, based on the travel time generated from the coastal proximity analysis. The outcome is a percentage index, allowing comparisons across regions or time periods to analyze spatial or temporal shifts. The first step involves identifying the total area surveyed by a project, and then the combined sum of the land used in each chronological period after being put through the weighted regression model. The example I use to test this index is the Gunia project, which focuses on the Mirabello region in east-central Crete. The major pattern evident from the results is that the Middle Minoan 1b to Late Minoan 1a sees the highest evidence of coastscape engagement, highlighted in red, with the index at above 1%, while Late Minoan 1b to 3c and the final Neolithic see the lowest, conversely being approximately 10 to 14 times lower than the higher extent in the Middle Bronze Age. Beginning with the final Neolithic, the pattern observed is not unexpected. The preference for defensive sites suggests a concern for safety that has been linked to an arrival of people from outside of Crete by Christoph Nowicki. The evidence within this study area is sparse and sites are fairly small, making only a very small contribution to the index. In fact, the occupation of both defensive sites in the coastal regions, for example, Sfogaras, and inland defensive sites, for example, Vasiliki Kefala, within the study area, could tentatively suggest areas of immigrant populations by the coast and pre-existing populations inland, though material culture studies may more accurately determine this. There is an increase in general activity in early Minoan 1, which could be interpreted as a result of population increase, and many of these new sites are within the coastal areas, increasing the coastal engagement index. This shift could be explained by changes in subsistence strategies, with a shift from pastoralism, more in towards the hills, towards an intensive production of crops in more arable areas, thus necessitating more of a use of the arable lands closer to the coast. Early Minoan 2a coincides with this period of international spirit, seen more widely in the Aegean, as I mentioned earlier, and this period sees a corresponding increase in coastscape engagement. External contact in the region is evident through material manifestations such as imported obsidian and marble figurines and metals, to name just a few, but also in terms of practices such as a cycladic influence on pottery production and burial practices. And this interaction outside of Crete may have initiated more of a pull towards the settlement patterns to be more in the coastal area. A reduction of coastal activity in early Minoan 2b aligns with a period of contemporary Aegean network collapse. Destructions at Vasiliki within the survey area and at coastal sites elsewhere on the island, such as at Malia and Myrtos Pyrgos, may underlie this coastal activity decline. However, activity at the major site within the survey area, Gounia, continues, including burials at Sfogaras and external trade evidenced through gold and silver jewellery. And this indicates a continuity in external contact. The changes were perhaps driven by internal competition and possible new settlers from a disrupted Aegean, and these could explain destructions and a reduced coastal engagement within this phase. Early Minoan 3 can be characterised with a general lower evidence of activity in the survey area, with around only 20 sites. The slight increase in coastal engagement may reflect a small-scale resettling of the coastal areas, though this could also indicate an arrival of immigrants from elsewhere. The surveyors of the Gounia region suggest an arrival of Cycladic colonists during this time, who may have displaced settlement patterns at the end of early Minoan 2b, or settled into depopulated areas at some point in early Minoan 3. Cyst graves, a Cycladic type until this point, emerge at Pakiamos in the study area, and there are some Cycladic influences in terms of local pottery. Middle Minoan 1b, however, sees the beginning of a more intensive engagement with the coastal areas, with an impressive 75 sites now known from the area, occupying most lower-lying landscape niches. This trend mirrors patterns seen across Crete in terms of rural farmsteads, hamlets, and larger sites or larger villages such as Gounia, which by this stage at a minimum of 2.8 hectares have developed, though they are overshadowed by contemporary palatial centres elsewhere on Crete, such as Knossos at 100 hectares and Festos at 90. The coastal focus of the proto-palatial period was likely fostered by the stability brought around by the first palaces. This period also marks the intensification of Minoan interest beyond Crete, initially for raw materials, but eventually leading to Minoanization in various regions of the Aegean in terms of the adoption of Minoan cultural traits. And this pattern continues pretty much throughout into the Neo-Palatial period. And late Minoan 1b ushers in a period of much reduced coastal engagement, which continues until late Minoan 3c, the terminus of this particular analysis. A reduction in coastal activity is linked by the surveyors to the Thera eruption and nucleation at Gounia, which becomes more pronounced in the late Minoan 1b data. The cause of the late Minoan 1b destructions on Crete have been fiercely debated, and the surveyors indicate a preference for a Cnossian takeover before a Mycenaean invasion at the end of late Minoan 1b. If this is indeed true, the uncertainty of the period appears to have led to a reduced activity within the survey area more generally, and not just closer to the coast. And this is seen particularly more clearly in the late Minoan 2 survey data. After late Minoan 2, most of the major sites of the region were abandoned, and coastal activity is much reduced, with more activity further inland. The general reduction in the area, however, may more accurately reflect a drastic depopulation of the survey area, though the complete absence of Lake Minoan 3C coastal sites is noteworthy. The third and final marker I introduced this evening, the tone will shift to a more experimental discussion. The maritime territorial extent intends to determine whether a site in question had maritime space incorporated into its reconstructed territory. This reconstructed territory is derived from walking catchments generated using the cost surface derived from Tobler's hiking function and the local topographical features with a 20-minute and a 60-minute catchment operationalized for each site. Now, determining the territory of an ancient site is highly subjective, and though there are models and previous suggestions to work from. For this analysis, I have used von Thunen's analysis of agricultural space, which would suggest that the key activities take place within a 20-minute walking distance of a site and a medium distance of 1 hour for less important activities. Though I would be very interested at the end of this talk if anybody has any alternative suggestions, because this is a fairly old model. Philosophically, this marker uses Paul Cloak et al.'s assertion in Approaching Human Geography that the significance of place correlates with distance from human to place. Where these walking catchments intersect with a paleo coastline, a length measurement is taken, effectively to measure how much of a coastline was exposed to human agency. This serves to indicate which sites had the coastline within their core activity or 20-minute walking distance zone. These length measurements are then added together for each period to derive general chronological trends. We can suggest as a null hypothesis that if the coastline is within a 20-minute walk, there is a higher probability that the inhabitants of that settlement interacted with the sea, while those within 60 minutes walking distance would have had a significantly lower probability of regular embodied interaction with a coastal space. Those sites which have no coastline within a 1 hour distance could also be again to have said an even lower probability of regular embodied action with the sea and the coastal spaces. To highlight this marker, I used the prehistoric field walking data from the Pylos Regional Archaeological Project and the Minnesota Messenia Expedition surveys from Messenia. In 1972, MacDonald and Hope Simpson suggested that in Messenia, there was a reluctance to be situated in coastal locations in the Middle Bronze Age, in contrast to the early Helladic period. The late Helladic period, similarly, is identified as one with a focus more on the interior of the landscape, though perhaps with the presence of a few more coastal sites. An issue, unfortunately, is that they do not divide their data into the various subphases of the Aegean Bronze Age, and, for example, early Helladic II or late Helladic III. And what I do here is attempt to follow their same general chronology to see if their conclusions hold up in the face of the evidence. From the data that they collated, I have omitted burial spaces to focus more on places of habitation, unless there is a pre-existing evidence of a habitation site which underlies a later burial space. So the remaining sites, of which there were 175, were then put through the r.walk function of QGIS and GRASS. What this does is to use the cost surface raster used in the other markers to generate an area extending out in all directions. This denotes where it would be feasible to walk within a 20-minute distance, and also 60 minutes. These generated rasters were then converted into vectors, which were then intersected with the paleo sea level. The intersected elements were then converted from points to paths, and then geometrical attributes then added. The remaining shapefile gives the length of the meters or extent of the paleo coastline that was exposed to these walking distances. So how does it measure up? Well, it seems that generally MacDonald and Hope Simpson were correct in their assessment. And now we have the data to reinforce that. Before discussing the maritime territorial extent, we can talk with just simple numbers. Out of 31 early Helladic sites taken from the material, 15 were within a 20-minute walking distance from the coast. amounting to just over 48% of these sites. As MacDonald and Hope Simpson suspected, there is a reduction in coastal proximity in the Middle Helladic period. However, the data is not quite as pessimistic as they suggest, with 25% of sites being within a 20-minute walking distance. The Late Helladic period does see a general continuity of this Middle Helladic trend, despite a substantial increase in settlement activity. Just below 25% of sites are within the 20-minute walking distance. What was unexpected from this analysis, however, was the general similarities in terms of the 60-minute walking distances, which remain at roughly around 60% throughout the Bronze Age, which was quite unexpected. However, the 20-minute walking catchment, which is the more core territory, does show a much clearer pattern towards the early Helladic period. And these figures are also reinforced if we consider the extent of the maritime territory. While the early Helladic period has the lowest amount of coastline exposed to the various settlements in existence during that period, and the Late Helladic period the largest, if we adjust for the number of sites known in these periods, then a pattern emerges. Nearly 3 times as much of the coastline is exposed to the 20-minute zone of early Helladic sites, rather than their Middle Helladic counterparts, and roughly twice as much as Late Helladic sites. This means that early Helladic sites appear to have been placed in positions that were in a shorter distance of more coastline, which may have been to take advantage of usable bays and capes for paddle boats. By the Late Helladic period, it is more likely that fewer specialist coastal sites were entryway points into the Messenian landscape. An additional interpretation is also that state formation may have led to an increasing hierarchy and a reduction in the need for multiple coastal settlements in each landscape niche, where one central sponsored site would suffice. This analysis does not disprove the arguments of MacDonald and Hope Simpson, and to the contrary backs up their arguments, with more meaningful data derived from backs up their arguments with more meaningful data than those derived from cartographic and Euclidean analysis alone. So bringing this talk to a close, the spatial markers presented here allow for a spatial analysis of coastal activity in Aegean prehistory, but can also be applied to other areas and chronological periods. They classify and quantify human agency within the coastal zone, serving as useful starting and comparison points for discussion of coastscape engagement. They aim to take debate beyond cartographic and Euclidean models of space, incorporating temporality and landscape into spatial discussion. These markers highlight that there were differing societal approaches to the utilization of coastscapes, which were socially derived and locally specific. These approaches generate new perspectives from legacy survey data, confirming or rejecting previous interpretations while offering new avenues for research. And I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very, very, very much for this very intriguing talk. I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. Please.
How do you think, what do you think about how ancient Greeks choose a place, special place to build?
How?
For example, have you been to Epidavros?
To Epidavros?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's not only theater, it's a therapeutic and athletic site. The etymology of the word Epidavros in Greek means epi, above, other, the body element. So I think that this is was the criteria that ancient Greeks choose this site to build all this.
I think, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking what would I suggest is the main criteria for choosing a specific location, right? So I would suggest that these criteria are quite multiple. They're multivariate. What I'm doing here with this particular project is not necessarily to determine why people settled, but the fact that they did, and to determine whether those relate to other things. So in my doctoral thesis, I looked into human-sea interaction from the various different lenses, from sort of the spatial to the more metaphysical, as you allude to, and the sort of how people perceive the space around them. What this particular project does is to sort of classify and quantify something which has not really been so explicitly theorized, really. Further work within looking at the material culture might sort of give you a bit more of an indication of other reasons why they might live in a particular spot. But I would argue that what I would love to do with this particular project, for example, is at the moment I'm looking at this distance between coastline and places where people live. It would be great to incorporate things like soil types, to incorporate things like hydrology, to incorporate things like view sheds, to give a more sort of concrete thing, sort of saying, right, okay, all of these things together, are they settling in the coastal area because the land is really, really good there? Or are they settling there because there's usable bays or places to take advantage of external sea-related contact? But in terms of why people specifically chose destinations, we can never really know, unfortunately.
I think another criterion, my opinion, is that the East Mediterranean is highly seismogenic. For example, the volcano of Santorini shook the whole Aegean Sea.
Well, I think that certainly would account, if I look back at the data that I presented from the Gornea region, I think it may have, something like that, may have had certainly an impact in whether people wanted to live beside the coast. And as you say, it was quite a big issue, I think, for a lot of people in the Aegean during that time, with earthquakes, tsunamis, potentially. So, of course, that would give one reason not to live beside the coast. And I think the data kind of shows that to a certain extent. So certainly, yeah, there is more than just... There are other things you can add, but those require a more contextual approach to each specific site. What I'm looking at is more sort of the wider settlement patterns, if that makes sense.
If I may step into that,
sure.
Just very briefly, because it's a very basic question, but maybe I missed it. But the tricky thing when dealing with coasts is that they change.
Absolutely.
And so how did you incorporate that into your studies? Because obviously when you're looking at, especially in longer periods of time, and relating spatial distribution of sites to the proximity to coasts, you have to be sure that the coastline that one observed in, just remember the Messenia, where they're saying that 31% or whatever was near to the coast. Of course, it's near to the coast now.
Yes, yeah.
But was that actually the case? So because you were presenting to us very different case studies from different regions within the Aegean, and of course there, also specifically on a more regional scale, you have a lot of diversity in terms of coastal changes at the time. So how did you account for that?
Well, you're quite correct to point out that it's a huge issue. And what I did during this particular project was to use the estimations which were provided by Kurt Lambeck. So what he did was to look into sea level change, basically since I think the last glacial maximum, and to predict a sort of a curve. And this curve changes depending on which part of the Aegean you're in. So I think the southern Aegean is, the sea change has been slightly more due to sort of the balancing of the landscape. And as you go further north, it becomes slightly less pronounced. But these data suggest, of course, they're general estimations because we can never truly know exactly what the exact sea level was. But there are several sites where we know we're underwater now, for example, and they would have been considerably, Pazo Petri, for example, in southern Laconia. And so to estimate that, I used digital bathymetric models, which are basically like digital elevation, but for the sea, the opposite, I guess. And you can kind of mix these two together and kind of get an estimation of moving it up sort of 1, 2, 3, 5, 7 meters. And it gives you a nice kind of sort of reconstructed paleo landscape. It's not an exact science because obviously there are certain localized changes that you could, several which we unfortunately don't have the research on, but some which we can. So yeah, just incorporating these different things and giving sort of the best estimate that I can really derive from what we have, basically.
Sure. So when you presented these maps and the statistics, basically you're saying, so this is I'm accounting for that. This
yes, absolutely. These values. Yeah.
Of that time period.
Absolutely. These are the data are derived from the sort of scaling down the sea, if we can call it that, and what the sort of the configuration was in that time. Obviously estimated, but.
Sure. Further questions, please.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
I have no problem with 3D models. You presented, I can see the logic and I think that they're useful. I have two reservations. The one was just mentioned. It's about the, unfortunately for you, the coastline is perhaps the part of the Greek landscape which changes more often. And it's not just about the sea level. It's about erosion, it's about aviation, it's about marshes, all sorts of things. I mean, sites were sometimes abandoned not because they were not doing sea contact anymore, maritime trawls, but just because there was a marsh, so they cannot stand anymore. Or what happened in Tiris and what the Mycenaeans did for Tiris in order to be viable to live, such things. So I think you have to be a bit more specific in your case studies to see what is happening in terms of what's happening in the sea coast. The other reservation, it's not something, it is manageable, but still, I mean, something that should be seen ad hoc in this case. My second reservation is about distance, because, okay, you talk about walking distance at no problem at all, but usually distance is not only walking distance, it depends on many things, like, for example, what you transport, what you have to carry, whether it's bulky items or just fish. And also the means of transportation. You based many things on Minor Crete, but at least until the end of the Nepalese, there is no evidence for donkeys or for horses. And okay, forget horses, we were not for carrying things until the end of the Mycenaean period, but still, I mean, everything depends on what is happening. For example, in the Iron Age, in the Archaic period, all the big Cretan city-states were in the at least very far from the sea, but still there is no evidence that Crete was not doing maritime contracts. Actually, Cretans were famous pirates and all sorts of things. So I guess, I mean, you have to consider other parameters that have to do with distance. It's not just for a person to walk, but also what to carry under what means of transportation. Just to mention that.
No, it's something I've tried to think how I can take it further. So these are fairly preliminary ideas. So what I would love to do is model some of these things into it. As you say, there is a debate about the donkey when that sort of first really comes in, and there's a few different opinions. So it's difficult to say really, like, okay, it's this time period. I would also love to sort of take it to the other side and look into modelling travel by sea, for example. This would be really nice too, but there's only so many hours in the day, unfortunately. These analyses are exceedingly repetitive. I just would love to write, if anybody is good with scripts, please let me know, because I would love to just put a script in and say, bang, do it. But unfortunately, it's not so far possible. So there's a lot of sort of, data collection that is driving me insane. But in terms of carrying things, this is difficult. This is, my thought has been to sort of give a ballpark figure. This is sort of like the least cost that you could theoretically do in terms of time. Obviously, there are different bodies, different ages, different levels of fitness, different all kinds of different factors which could change that value. There's no real way to necessarily account for that element, but it certainly would be nice to, what I would also like to do is incorporate these sort of so-called least cost corridors, which are sort of like not just the path itself, but sort of like a range of paths which would give you the most likely sort of to a 90-something% probability. But again, you know, this is something to take further. But yes, that's certainly something I would love to take into the next stages. Thank you.
If I may, and the others can think about further questions, but coming back to the coast,
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's because I was also thinking, I had that exactly in mind as well, because it's not only the changing coastlines, but it really is access to the coast
Mm-hmm.
does not necessarily mean that that access is actually meaningful.
Yes. Yes.
Because if there's a swamp or a marsh or whatever, it doesn't matter actually. Actually, it's more of an hindrance.
Yeah.
than it is
Absolutely.
something
Yeah.
possible. And so you were talking about, you know, having or taking the perspective out towards the sea.
Mm.
I think that would be a very promising endeavor to take, because you really, I think you could really, because specifically when you're dealing with different case studies. So you're dealing with Crete, you're dealing with the Argolis, you're dealing with Messenia. So very different regions in Greece where you can really go into the regional specifics of these things and look at changing winds, anchorage points. I mostly deal with historic periods, so I know, at least in the German field, there's this huge thing. You were talking about scapes earlier. Harbor scapes is a big thing now.
Yeah. There's.
So it's interesting thinking about, you know, where people can really anchorage, how that shifts and changes through time,
Mm-hmm.
and it does. I mean, is that courseway? We were talking about in Cyprus, for example, and we have the same problem. You know, trying to model, you know, access towards the coast does not necessarily mean that that is, let's say, economically
Mm-hmm.
valuable. It just means that yes, then you can reach so far, and then you have a cliff, and then there's
Yeah. Yeah.
But does that really mean that you could really, that is that a economic corridor that you could really exploit? So to really look at that thing, the changing winds and tides and stuff like that, and just really coming to the steep perspective and see how, because yeah, I think the last example was Konya, was it? I think.
Second.
I'm sorry. No. Well, anyway, you could really see, you know, that in that small little bay areas, and to relate, you know, how that changed and shifts. Also. Because you can also see it in historic periods. If you look at the islands, how, you know, just one bay is occupied, you know, by a certain means, and is it industrial shipping or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and then it changed when that need also shifts. So I think really just expanding the perspective also to seascape, I feel could be very, very profitable.
One thing that kind of comes out when you model these different sea levels is that places you thought were really great harbours and great sort of harbour sites just disappear.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So a really good example of this would be Vodokiliad Bay in Messenia. Great harbour, but when you model the landscape change, it's gone. So it's sometimes the sort of the topography of the coastline can change quite radically. This can be modelled. What you can do is to look into sort of which ones look from the paleo-topographical perspective, which ones look like they could be particularly good sort of candidates. I know that the Eastern Corinthia survey did some sort of site prediction analysis of sort of the east coast of Corinthia, and found coastal sites, harbour sites. But yeah, when it comes to things like marshes, it's very difficult to know unless it still exists today, or unless there's a historical record of it existing.
We have a very large project where you have core drilling.
Exactly. This is just me. This is just me and my laptop. I would love to, put cores down here and there. I can give you the best estimation that I can get from the data that is commonly available. Again, sort of taking this further, what I would love to do is to sort of identify more likely candidates for sort of usable harbours. Obviously, the criteria would change depending on which period of the Bronze Age that you're in. But that's sort of one of the major next steps of this. No, you're quite right. It's a very complex issue.
Well, it's a good thing.
Well,
Because it serves as a valuable outlook for further projects for the work. So
Yeah.
it just shows us that we're still.
It's always good to have problems.
Two shows of hands.
If I can add something else, just another interpretive factor. You tend to interpret habitation next to the coastline, the exploitation of the sea. But we are in Greece with very difficult terrain, so sometimes the coastal places are the best places to cultivate because the coastal places are the most.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So sometimes you may see in certain periods, for certain historical reasons, a movement towards the coastline for farming instead of. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but again, it has to do with the context and other factors.
Yeah, I think that's why it's really nice to take into consideration the whole landscape, not just this coastal strip. Because if you do that, of course, as you say, it could be one or the other. I would suggest that type of thing can only really be determined through sort of material culture. And that's sort of like, well, not necessarily the next step, but this is sort of like a step, a big step further on. But but this particular, all these markers sort of give me a little bit of a sort of clue, sort of to shine the light on these particular zones where it might be nice to look a bit further potentially. But no, there are certainly other factors to consider for sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm interested to know, what kind of data do you collect? Do you also collect, for example, the geomorphology data? And I saw you also categorize the data into farmstead, villages. Do you also go according to that, in your mapping?
So the data I sort of collect is everything that they give, which can be quite variable. If they offer site sizes, that's great, because that means I have an indication of how big the site is and how sort of, its extent and how it relates to its landscape. Very often that isn't provided. I tend to collate all of the sort of ceramic data too, to give a more sort of clear indication of the phasing of each site. The local chronologies can sort of differ, so sort of stitching it all together can be a little difficult sometimes in terms of what relates to what and different periods. The geomorphological data, I implement it when it's known. For example, for the Messenia stuff, I incorporated the Yalova sort of marshland that's sort of between Vodokilia and the main sort of areas. But very often this data is not really put out there. This is actually one of the big sort of philosophical enterprises that I'm trying to get at, is that all of this data that I generate, all of these shape files will go online to be available for people to use. Because there's no point me keep doing this and then someone else has to do it again and someone else has to do it again. If it's there, and then people can choose what they want to use. But unfortunately, a lot of surveys, I think we're starting to get to the point where the survey data is starting to become much more open to people to use, but we're not quite there yet. Some surveys have more open source data and you can kind of play around with their catalogs and their shape files and things like that and their data, but with some it's less easy. So where it is known, I do incorporate it. Hopefully that answers you. Sorry, fairly long-winded answer, but.
First question we have.
Thank you, Chris, very much for your presentation. In surveys, they often mention also site sizes. As they give also this information.
Yes.
Would you consider using this as a variable for your estimations, or is it something you don't want?
For the second marker, the coastscape engagement index, that's the primary, sort of one of the main data sources. So the idea is that a large coastal site, sort of a huge, sort of several hectare site, means there's obviously a lot more people living there. So the population of that region is much more focused within a coastal space. You may also have sort of 10 to 15 sort of more inland, smaller sites, which could represent sort of agricultural use. So it's not necessarily the numbers, it's sort of the size, but unfortunately the size isn't always indicated. So where it is known, I can then take that data and sort of give more of an idea through using that marker where the population is concentrated within a particular landscape. If you have several sites further inland which are of a large size and a few sort of small coastal sites, then it's probably more of an indication that the inland was being used an awful lot more than the coastal space. So it's about sort of determining that relationship. It is possible for some surveys, which is great, but again, not all, unfortunately.
I think kind of could answer it just now. I was wondering, when you have a reduced number of coastal sites, so this is more, how can you distinguish between less interest in a coast or just channeling it in fewer sites?
Yeah. This particular marker kind of tries to sort of fix that in terms of including the site sizes. Again, sort of, one thing that could be implemented is sort of populations, but then again, you're sort of going into another zone of estimation based on size and things like that, which is another sort of minefield in itself. But yeah, this second marker, I think the first one, the coastal proximity analysis, is kind of good for sort of survey data when you don't really have that level of analysis where there's only just the dots on the map and you don't really know what's going on. It can give you sort of a general idea. When we have more data, we can then use the second. The third is fairly experimental, and that's kind of something I'm really working on, and I've yet to hear a suggestion for some alternative, so I hope I'm on the right track with that one. But yeah, the site sizes are something that's really nice to include. The classifications is something I've avoided doing, because you can determine obviously a site that has a mortuary function, a site that has a certain size, and some surveys do classify them according to, for example, the Southern Argolid survey has these sort of site size criteria and how they classify each site, and I've used those just to sort of show their data reflected in my data. But I'm a little hesitant to really go too much into that, because we don't know exactly whether that's a past reality, if that makes sense, whether that site has been totally eroded away through agriculture activities, through erosion. We can only really work with what we have, so I would love to see more site sizes in surveys, definitely.
Right. One last final question.
I'm just curious, what kind of information do you give to the artificial intelligence and create this image?
To what, sorry?
Artificial intelligence. I saw.
Yes. I'm very proud of that one. I had a great conversation with the AI. One of the more productive conversations with AI. Get there in the end.
What was the task that you gave to him?
Yeah, I think I just asked for coastal landscape, Greece, and some other.
Prehistoric Greece.
Yeah, that was kind of the suggestion, and it came back with a really great one. Wait, there we go. Sorry, it's scrolling itself now. This one. Yes. Yeah.
Is it a free one?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay.
It's. Yeah.
Okay.
It's.
So which one would you imagine? Are we in the Argolis? Are we in...
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, to figure out. Yeah. We're in a fantasy land.
Which is great. Technology never ceases to surprise. Yes.
Okay.
On that note, I guess thank you once again very much for coming.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you all.
Thank you for all coming.
Great.